This rare speech shows you how to rewire your mind. Curious. Imagine for a moment that you are sitting at your desk, scanning an urgent email. Suddenly, your heart rate spikes, your breathing turns shallow, your palms grow cool as blood rushes toward your limbs. In a fraction of a second, your vision narrows, focused purely on a threat that isn't physical, but psychological. A defensive reply drafted in anger, a wave of panic about a deadline, or a surge of self-doubt. Pause. What just happened inside your skull? Long before your rational mind could weigh in, a tiny almond-sized structure deep within your subcortical brain, the amygdala, sounded an alarm. It hijacked your physiology. It triggered a cascade of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, overriding the seat of your executive function, the prefrontal cortex. Most of us live our lives entirely at the mercy of these automated neural scripts. We believe that when we feel anxious, angry, or overwhelmed, we are simply reacting to the world around us. We treat our emotional default settings as fixed traits, declaring, "That is just who I am." But modern neuroscience reveals a startling truth. Your brain is not hardwired. It is soft-wired. Through the mechanism of neuroplasticity, every thought, every focus of attention, and every emotional response carves physical pathways into your brain's architecture. When you repeat a reaction, that neural highway grows wider, faster, and more automatic. But when you introduce intentional awareness, you begin to dismantle that pathway and lay down a new one. If you leave this room or turn away from this message without understanding how this mechanism works, you remain a passenger inside your own head. You will continue to let ancient evolutionary biology run your modern daily decisions, your relationships, and your leadership. However, if you give me your full attention for the next few minutes, I will share the exact cognitive blueprint that bridges behavioral science and emotional mastery. You will learn not just how to tame the emotional hijack, but how to deliberately rewire your brain's neural pathways for sustained focus, resilience, and emotional intelligence. Automated emotional reactions happen milliseconds before conscious thought, but focused awareness acts as a manual override to calm the brain's alarm system. Neural circuits that fire together wire together. Every time you consciously redirect your attention, you physically alter the architecture of your prefrontal cortex. Our emotions are contagious. By mastering self-regulation, you fundamentally alter the emotional state and neural responses of the people around you. Emotional intelligence relies on cognitive control, the ability to observe your internal state without immediately acting on it. Neural rewiring does not require drastic life changes. It requires consistent, intentional micro-moments of focused attention. Neuroplasticity is not merely a passive biological curiosity or a background process that happens while we live our lives. It is an active, dynamic, and continuous mechanism that shapes the very physical architecture of our brain every single second. For generations, society operated under the flawed dogma that the adult human brain was a fixed structure, a rigid machine whose wiring was finalized during early development and thereafter could only degrade. Modern neuroscience has completely shattered this deterministic view. The brain you have today is not the brain you had 5 years ago, nor is it the brain you will have 5 years from now, because it is constantly being reshaped by the nature of your lived experience and, most importantly, where you consistently direct your attention. At its core, neuroplasticity means that neurons that fire together literally wire together. Every single time you entertain a specific thought, indulge in an emotional reaction, or perform a behavior, a distinct network of brain cells communicates via electrical and chemical signals. If you repeat that thought or emotional reaction frequently, the synaptic connections between those specific neurons grow stronger, thicker, and far more efficient. The insulating layer around those nerve fibers, known as the myelin sheath, thickens along these frequently traveled pathways, transforming what was once a faint signal into a high-speed, automatic neural superhighway. This biological process operates without moral judgment. It does not distinguish between habits that serve your highest potential and habits that cause you deep suffering. If you spend hours each day cultivating worry, self-doubt, or catastrophic thinking, your brain recognizes this focus as a priority and diligently spends its biological resources building a physical structure optimized for anxiety. You become, quite literally, a master at generating stress because you have spent years practicing it at a cellular level. Conversely, when you deliberately pivot your attention toward presence, focused problem solving, composure, or gratitude, you ignite entirely different neural circuits. As those constructive pathways are repeatedly activated, they expand, while the unused networks responsible for your old reactive patterns begin to weaken and wither away through a biological process known as synaptic pruning. What this means in practice is that your mind is not an unchangeable trait or a static vessel. It is a living, sculptable organ. You are not a helpless victim of your default mental habits, nor are you permanently trapped by the emotional patterns you developed in childhood or adolescence. Attention acts as the ultimate sculpting tool in this process, operating as a biological signal that tells your brain which structural connections to reinforce and which to abandon. Wherever your attention rests, metabolic energy, oxygen, and growth factors flow to those specific neural networks, physically altering the landscape of your mind. Understanding this active nature of neuroplasticity places an immense and empowering responsibility in your hands. It transforms personal development from a vague, abstract goal into an actionable, biological project. Every moment you choose conscious awareness over automatic reaction, you are actively writing new code into your neural software, demonstrating that mental transformation is not a matter of luck or innate talent, but a direct result of how you train the physical machinery of your attention daily. To truly understand how we can alter our mental baseline, we must examine the fundamental mechanics of what happens when we feel hijacked by our emotions, and how a simple mental intervention can dramatically alter our neurobiology. Deep within the primitive limbic region of the human brain lies the amygdala, a pair of small, almond-shaped structures that serve as our primary survival alarm system. Evolutionary biology designed the amygdala to react instantly to perceived danger, initiating the survival responses of fight, flight, or freeze, long before the conscious mind even registers what is happening. When a threat, whether it is a physical predator or a harsh critique from a colleague, triggers the amygdala, it initiates a high-speed chemical cascade, flooding the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. Crucially, during this process of emotional hijacking, the brain deliberately diverts energy and blood flow away from the prefrontal cortex, the sophisticated structure located right behind your forehead, responsible for logical reasoning, emotional regulation, decision-making, and self-reflection. In simple terms, when the amygdala takes complete control, your executive function goes offline, leaving you at the mercy of automatic, primitive, and often destructive impulse reactions. Most people spend their lives believing that their immediate emotional reaction is the only possible reality, reacting to life's triggers in a state of continuous biological impulsivity. However, the key to reclaiming control over your internal state lies in cultivating the capacity to insert a deliberate pause between a trigger and your reaction. When you experience a spike of stress or anger, and train yourself to simply notice that internal state rather than immediately acting upon it, you perform a profound biological shift. Neurological research demonstrates that the act of step-back self-observation, such as silently naming an emotion like, "I am experiencing anger," or "this is anxiety," immediately activates the prefrontal cortex. This mental step activates explicit neural pathways that send inhibitory signals directly down to the amygdala, effectively turning down the volume of the alarm bell. You do not suppress or deny the emotion. Rather, you shift your brain's processing from the reactive limbic system back to the rational executive center. This single moment of conscious awareness restores your capacity for high-level cognitive function, allowing you to move from an automatic, conditioned reaction to a thoughtful, intentional response. By practicing this intentional pause during moments of rising friction, you progressively weaken the automatic pathways that drive emotional reactivity. Over time, the neural bridges connecting your prefrontal cortex to your emotional centers strengthen, creating a permanent buffer between stimulus and response. This mental space grants you the freedom to choose composure over hostility, clarity over panic, and wisdom over impulse. Reclaiming your mind does not require you to eliminate difficult emotions altogether, but rather to master the art of stepping into the prefrontal pause, ensuring that your rational executive function remains the true pilot of your life rather than allowing an ancient survival mechanism to dictate your actions and outcomes. Attention is far more than a passive filter through which we experience the world. It is the primary biological engine that drives the physical growth, structural alteration, and functional organization of the human brain. To understand the sheer power of selective attention, one must realize that the brain is constantly bombarded with billions of bits of sensory information every single second, ranging from background noises and visual stimuli to internal bodily sensations and floating thoughts. Because the brain cannot possibly process every piece of incoming data with equal intensity, it relies on the mechanism of attention to act as an executive gatekeeper. Wherever you direct the spotlight of your attention, you are effectively signaling to your central nervous system that this specific information matters above all else. This mental spotlight acts as a biological trigger that directs metabolic resources, such as blood flow, oxygen, and glucose, straight to the specific neural circuits involved in processing that focus. In accordance with the principles of neuroplasticity, the neural pathways that are repeatedly bathed in these biological resources strengthen their synaptic connections, thicken their protective myelin sheaths, and become faster and more efficient at firing in the future. Conversely, the neural circuits that are consistently ignored, neglected, or intentionally bypassed receive fewer resources and gradually weaken over time through synaptic pruning. This means that your attentional habits are actively sculpting the physical landscape of your brain day after day, whether you are conscious of it or not. If you allow your attention to be constantly fragmented by digital notifications, endless multitasking, and superficial distractions, you are physically training your brain to build robust circuits optimized for distraction, mental fatigue, and short attention spans. On the other hand, when you deliberately train the spotlight of your attention to remain anchored on a single object, whether that is the physical sensation of your breath, an intricate problem at work, or a deep conversation with another human being, you are engaging in a form of targeted mental weightlifting. Every single time your mind inevitably wanders and you catch yourself, notice the distraction and consciously pull the spotlight of your attention back to your chosen anchor. You perform a repetition that physically thickens the gray matter within your prefrontal cortex. This deliberate management of focus is what separates those who are swept away by their internal chatter from those who master their mental faculties. Attention is the core currency of human experience and the definitive tool for neural transformation. What you pay attention to literally becomes your reality at both a psychological and a biological level. By treating your attention as a precious, highly powerful instrument rather than an open vessel at the mercy of external environment, you reclaim the power to shape your cognitive abilities, your emotional resilience, and the overall trajectory of your intellectual life. We often operate under the false assumption that raw intelligence, technical skill, and logical capability are the sole engines of high cognitive performance and personal achievement. However, neuroscience reveals a very different truth. Your intellectual capacity is fundamentally constrained and dictated by your ability to manage your emotional state. The prefrontal cortex, which serves as the seat of working memory, abstract reasoning, complex planning, and creative problem solving, is extraordinarily sensitive to emotional turbulence. When you experience unmanaged stress, chronic anxiety, or intense emotional distress, your body floods with stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine. At high concentrations, these neurochemicals disrupt the delicate signaling networks within the prefrontal cortex, effectively reducing your functional IQ, impairing your working memory, and severely narrowing your decision-making abilities. In simple terms, when you are emotionally dysregulated, you literally lose access to your highest intellectual capabilities. This is why brilliant individuals often make remarkably poor decisions when operating under unmanaged stress or intense personal conflict. True cognitive performance is not merely a matter of processing power, it is entirely dependent on emotional self-regulation serving as the baseline stabilizer. When you develop emotional self-awareness, you gain the ability to monitor your internal state in real time, identifying microspikes of tension, frustration, or overwhelm before they escalate into full-blown cognitive impairments. By actively regulating these emotional states through conscious breathing, cognitive reappraisal, or brief reflective pauses, you clear the neurochemical fog from your prefrontal circuits, restoring full blood flow and optimal electrical activity to the executive centers of the brain. Furthermore, emotional regulation preserves valuable cognitive energy that would otherwise be wasted on rumination, internal conflict, defensive posture, and chronic hypervigilance. A mind that is constantly managing unaddressed emotional friction is like a high-performance computer running dozens of background applications that drain its processing speed and battery life. By practicing emotional self-regulation, you close those resource-heavy background processes, freeing up vast amounts of working memory, creative focus, and mental stamina for the tasks that truly matter. Emotional regulation is not an impediment to rigorous logic, nor is it a soft skill reserved merely for personal well-being. It is the essential prerequisite for sustained high-level intellectual execution, strategic foresight, and elite cognitive performance in every domain of life. Real, long-lasting biological transformation of the human brain does not occur through rare, dramatic moments of revelation, massive lifestyle overhauls, or sporadic bursts of intense willpower. Instead, sustainable neural rewiring is driven entirely by the quiet daily accumulation of micro-practices grounded in conscious awareness and self-observation. The human nervous system is an adaptive organ designed to optimize for repetition, efficiency, and consistency rather than intensity. When people attempt to revolutionize their lives overnight through radical, overwhelming shifts in behavior, they almost universally trigger a threat response from the amygdala, which views sudden, massive changes as dangerous disruptions to homeostasis. This leads to immediate biological resistance, exhaustion, and an inevitable return to familiar default habits. True neural transformation bypasses this evolutionary resistance by utilizing the power of incremental, low-friction micro-practices. A micro-practice is a tiny, highly accessible shift in consciousness that takes only a few seconds or a couple of minutes to perform, yet yields profound structural results when repeated consistently over time. It is the deliberate decision to take one deep diaphragmatic breath before answering an irritating phone call. It is the brief 3-second pause to notice physical tension in your shoulders when an email lands in your inbox. It is the conscious act of catching your mind wandering into anxious future projections and gently escorting your focus back to the physical sensations of your feet on the ground. To the untrained eye, these fleeting moments of awareness appear insignificant, almost too small to make a meaningful impact on complex psychological patterns. However, at a cellular level, each micropractice represents an active electrical signal traveling through a chosen neural pathway, strengthening synaptic connections, recruiting neurochemicals like acetylcholine and dopamine, and signaling to the brain that this specific pattern of awareness is vital for survival and functioning. When you perform these tiny interventions dozens of times throughout a normal day, you are constantly applying a sculptor's chisel to your neural circuitry. Over weeks, months, and years, these micro moments compound exponentially, generating macro level shifts in your emotional baseline, stress tolerance, and default cognitive focus. You gradually discover that you are no longer easily triggered by environmental stressors, not because you fought a massive internal battle, but because your baseline neural infrastructure has physically changed to default to composure, clarity, and presence. Relying on massive, sweeping efforts to change your life is a recipe for burnout, but embracing tiny daily moments of non-judgmental self-observation and conscious focus turns the daily grind of life into a continuous training ground for structural mental evolution.